Far below the crowded streets of London, deeper than most witches and wizards ever imagine, there are vaults where gold has rested for generations. The polished white marble of Gringotts Wizarding Bank reflects the glow of enchanted lamps. Iron doors stand sealed behind intricate spells. Somewhere in the darkness, a goblin hammer strikes metal. The sound carries through the stone corridors in a steady rhythm, ringing once, then fading into silence before returning again. It is an ordinary sound in a goblin workplace. Yet if you listen carefully enough, it almost resembles a distant drum beat. Long before Harry Potter ever stepped into Gringotts with Hagrid in 1991, long before Lord Voldemort rose and fell, long before the Ministry of Magic established its authority over Wizarding Britain, similar sounds echoed beneath mountains and through underground workshops where goblins forged treasures that would outlive kingdoms. Why did the relationship between wizards and goblins repeatedly collapse into rebellion when both sides depended upon one another? The question sits at the heart of nearly 1,000 years of magical history. The goblins controlled skills that wizarding society desperately needed. Their reputation as metalworkers became legendary. Goblin-made silver, armor, jewelry, and enchanted objects were valued throughout Britain. The sword of Gryffindor itself, forged by the celebrated goblin smith Ragnuk I sometime during the Middle Ages, became one of the most famous magical artifacts ever created. Even centuries later, the sword retained properties that reflected goblin craftsmanship. It absorbed only substances that strengthened it, which is why basilisk venom enhanced the blade after Harry Potter used it in the Chamber of Secrets. Wizards admired such creations. They purchased them, displayed them, inherited them, and celebrated the goblins who made them. Yet admiration never became equality. The disagreement began with something that sounds deceptively simple: ownership. Wizards and goblins understood possession in fundamentally different ways. According to goblin tradition, the creator of an object remained its true owner. When a wizard purchased a goblin-made artifact, the buyer merely gained the right to use it during life. Upon death, the object should return to the goblin craftsman or the craftsman's descendants. Wizards saw matters differently. To them, a purchase was permanent. Ownership passed through families, through wills, through inheritance. The conflict appears repeatedly throughout wizarding history, but nowhere is it illustrated more clearly than in the story of the Sword of Gryffindor. Goblins maintained for centuries that the sword had been stolen from Ragnuk after its creation. Wizards insisted it had been fairly commissioned by Godric Gryffindor. Both versions survived into modern times, and neither side ever accepted the other's account. If ownership was one source of tension, why did wands become an even greater source of conflict? To understand that question, you must remember that wands occupy a unique position in magical society. In Britain, wand use became closely associated with citizenship, authority, and magical power. By the 17th century, the Ministry of Magic and its predecessors had established rules restricting wand possession to witches and wizards. Goblins, despite possessing their own forms of magic, were largely excluded from this privilege. From the wizarding perspective, this restriction seemed practical. From the goblin perspective, it looked like deliberate subjugation. Wizards frequently described goblins as dangerous when discussing wand rights. goblins frequently described wizards as hypocrites. Neither side trusted the other enough to compromise. The surviving records of early magical Britain are fragmentary, and that uncertainty leaves room for intriguing questions. We know from wizarding historical sources that tensions existed for centuries before the famous Goblin rebellions recorded in textbooks. We know goblins participated heavily in trade. We know they developed banking networks that would eventually become gringotts. We know wizard governments repeatedly negotiated with goblin communities. Yet very few details survive about daily interactions between ordinary goblins and ordinary wizards. History often preserves battles while forgetting conversations. A merchant purchasing enchanted silver from a goblin artisan leaves fewer records than a rebellion. A peaceful agreement disappears from memory more easily than a war. As a result, the centuries before the major uprisings feel strangely silent, like a corridor where footsteps have faded but their echoes remain. One detail appears again and again whenever wizard historians discuss goblins. They consistently describe them as highly intelligent, exceptionally skilled, and fiercely protective of their rights. Those descriptions emerged long before Harry's era. They appear in historical studies, ministry documents, and even in Professor Cuthbert Binns's famously dull History of Magic lectures at Hogwarts. Binns often spoke about goblin rebellions with such enthusiasm that students found themselves overwhelmed by dates and names. Hermione Granger listened carefully. Harry and Ron struggled to stay awake. Yet beneath Binns's endless recitations was an uncomfortable reality. The fact that Hogwarts devoted so much classroom time to goblin rebellions suggests how profoundly these conflicts shaped magical Britain. The rebellions were not isolated disturbances. They were recurring crises that repeatedly threatened the balance of the wizarding world. Why do so many wizard accounts portray goblins as troublemakers, while goblin grievances often sound understandable? The answer becomes more complicated the deeper you look. Wizards built institutions that excluded goblins from political power. Goblins responded with anger. Wizards feared that anger and imposed additional restrictions. Goblins interpreted those restrictions as further evidence of oppression. Each action reinforced the next. By the time the first major rebellions erupted, both sides had already spent generations convincing themselves that the other could not be trusted. Fear became tradition. Suspicion became law. What began as disagreements over property and magical rights slowly transformed into something much larger. The centuries leading into the 14th and 15th centuries saw a wizarding society becoming more organized. Powerful magical families expanded their influence. Regional authorities developed systems of governance. Trade networks connected communities across Britain. Goblins participated in this economy while remaining outside many of its political structures. Their skills made them valuable. Their independence made them difficult to control. This combination often produces conflict in history, whether magical or non-magical. A group that possesses wealth and expertise but lacks political representation rarely remains satisfied forever. The goblins understood their value. The wizards understood it too. The problem was that they drew very different conclusions from that reality. As the medieval period advanced, laws concerning magical creatures and beings became increasingly important. The distinction between a being and a creature would later become a major issue within the Ministry of Magic. Goblins generally insisted upon recognition as intelligent beings with rights comparable to those of wizards. Many wizard officials viewed them through a more restrictive lens. The debate was not merely semantic. Classification affected legal standing, representation, and influence. A society decides who belongs by deciding how people are categorized. Goblins recognized that fact early. It is one reason their disputes with wizard governments often focused on dignity as much as power. The arguments were never solely about gold or wands. They were also about status. The atmosphere before the first recorded uprisings resembles the sky before a storm. Nothing dramatic appears to be happening. Markets function, workshops operate, magical communities continue their routines. Yet beneath the surface, pressures accumulate. A disagreement over inheritance here. A dispute involving a goblin-made artifact there. A new regulation restricting wand use. Another failed negotiation. Another generation inheriting old resentments. By the time open rebellion finally emerges in the historical record, the conflict already feels ancient. The sparks that ignite the fire are important, but the wood has been drying for centuries. And so, as the hammer continues to ring somewhere deep within the vaults beneath London, the first true rebellions begin to approach. The records grow clearer, names start to appear, laws become stricter, goblin leaders become more vocal, wizard authorities become more determined. The uneasy partnership that had endured for generations begins to fracture in ways that neither side can fully control. Soon, the disputes that once unfolded across bargaining tables and workshop floors will spread into something far more dangerous, and the earliest recorded goblin rebellions will reveal just how fragile the peace between goblins and wizards had always been. Why do the earliest goblin rebellions appear in wizarding history almost fully formed, as though the conflict arrived suddenly from nowhere? When students at Hogwarts open their History of Magic textbooks, they encounter references to goblin rebellions scattered across centuries, yet the causes often receive far less attention than the battles themselves. By the 14th century, magical Britain was already a patchwork of wizarding communities connected by trade, family alliances, and increasingly formal systems of governance. Goblins occupied a unique position within that world. They forged valuable objects, handled precious metals, and accumulated considerable economic influence, but remained excluded from many of the privileges reserved for wand-carrying witches and wizards. The imbalance created a tension that could persist quietly for years before exploding into open resistance. History rarely remembers the decades of frustration that precede a revolt. It remembers the moment when patience finally breaks. One of the most important facts to understand is that goblins possess their own magic entirely separate from wand-based wizardry. This point is often overlooked because nearly every major story in the Harry Potter series is told from a wizard's perspective. Goblins could enchant metals, create magical protections, and craft objects of extraordinary power without relying upon wands. The Sword of Gryffindor remains the most famous example, but it was certainly not the only one. Goblin craftsmanship became so respected that wealthy wizarding families actively sought goblin-made treasures. At the same time, those same families often supported laws that prevented goblins From accessing the political structures governing magical Britain to the goblins, this contradiction must have appeared impossible to ignore. Their work was celebrated, yet their voices carried little authority. Why were wands treated as such a dangerous issue when goblins already possessed magic of their own? Wizard authorities repeatedly argued that wand ownership would fundamentally alter the balance of power within magical society. The exact details of these restrictions evolved over time, but the principle remained remarkably consistent. Wands were considered the domain of witches and wizards. Goblins challenged this assumption again and again. Some wizard historians described the debate as a matter of public safety. Goblin accounts, where fragments survive, suggest a different interpretation. They viewed wand restrictions as evidence that wizards feared genuine equality. Once a disagreement becomes tied to questions of status and identity, compromise becomes increasingly difficult. As the 15th century approached, tensions intensified. Wizarding governments were not yet organized under the Ministry of Magic, which would not be founded until 1707, but regional authorities and influential magical leaders still exercised considerable control. Laws varied from place to place. Enforcement was often inconsistent. In some regions, cooperation between goblins and wizards appears to have functioned reasonably well. In others, disputes became increasingly hostile. This uneven landscape created a cycle of uncertainty. A goblin community treated fairly in one area might face severe restrictions in another. Such conditions often encourage collective resistance because grievances become shared across communities rather than isolated incidents. The surviving historical references suggest that multiple goblin uprisings occurred during the late medieval period, though exact details remain scarce. Professor Binns occasionally referenced early rebellions in his lectures, grouping them among the many conflicts that shaped magical Britain before modern government emerged. Students generally found these lessons exhausting. Harry Potter once observed that Binns's voice sounded like an old vacuum cleaner. Yet behind the monotony of the lectures stood a remarkable reality. The goblin rebellions were significant enough to be taught generation after generation. Few conflicts maintain that prominence unless they repeatedly alter the course of history. The rebellions were not brief disturbances. They were recurring challenges to the existing order. Why does so much of this period remain hidden behind gaps in the historical record? One answer lies in who recorded history. Most surviving magical histories were written by witches and wizards. Their accounts naturally reflected wizarding perspectives. Goblin voices appear less frequently, not necessarily because goblins lacked their own records, but because relatively few entered mainstream wizarding scholarship. This imbalance creates a fascinating problem for historians. Imagine trying to reconstruct a centuries-long dispute while primarily hearing one side of the argument. The picture may still contain truth, but it will never be complete. This uncertainty allows certain mysteries to endure even after hundreds of years. Popular fan theory grows from exactly this problem. Some readers suggest that the wizarding world systematically underestimated goblin culture because most historical records originated from wizard institutions. The theory remains speculation rather than canon, but it highlights an interesting pattern. Whenever goblins appear directly in the series, they often demonstrate sophisticated traditions, strong communal memory, and deeply rooted legal principles. Griphook's explanation of goblin ownership in Deathly Hallows reveals a worldview entirely different from Harry's understanding of property. Neither side appears irrational. They simply begin from different assumptions. If similar misunderstandings existed for centuries, many conflicts become easier to understand. As tensions accumulated, another issue quietly emerged beneath the larger disputes. Goblins remembered grievances for generations. So did wizarding families. A disagreement involving one artifact or one law could survive long after the original participants had died. Children inherited stories from parents. Apprentices learned the perspectives of their masters. Historical memory became a force in its own right. By the time an actual rebellion erupted, participants often carried frustrations that stretched back decades. The conflict was never only about the present moment, it was also about every unresolved dispute that had come before. Why did wizard leaders fail to recognize how dangerous this situation was becoming? The answer may lie in the stability they believed they already possessed. Powerful groups often assume existing systems will continue functioning because those systems benefit them. From the wizarding perspective, goblins remained economically integrated into magical society. Trade continued. Goblin craftsmen still worked. Valuable goods still circulated. To many officials, these facts may have appeared reassuring, yet history repeatedly demonstrates that economic participation does not eliminate political frustration. Sometimes it sharpens it. People become even more aware of inequality when they can clearly see the wealth and influence they help create. The earliest recorded rebellions therefore emerged not from a single incident, but from a long accumulation of grievances. Wand restrictions, ownership disputes, legal inequality, and cultural misunderstandings combined into something increasingly difficult to contain. Small conflicts became larger ones. Local disagreements attracted wider support. Communities that once viewed their problems as isolated began recognizing common patterns. The result was the birth of a movement rather than a single revolt. Goblins across different regions increasingly understood themselves as participants in the same struggle. Then, as the centuries continued to turn, one rebellion rose above all the others. It would become one of the few goblin rebellions remembered not merely in dusty textbooks, but in a physical place that Harry Potter himself would eventually visit. The year was 1612. The location was Hogsmeade. And inside a building that future students would know as the Three Broomsticks, goblin rebels established a headquarters so bold, so unexpected, that centuries later visitors could still find a plaque commemorating the events that unfolded there. The age of scattered uprisings was ending. A larger confrontation was about to begin. Why would goblin rebels choose the very heart of wizarding Britain as their headquarters during one of the most famous uprisings in magical history? The question becomes even more striking when you consider the location itself. Hogsmeade was not an isolated settlement hidden in the wilderness. It was the only entirely wizarding village in Britain, a place founded centuries earlier by the medieval wizard Hengist of Woodcroft after he fled Muggle persecution. Wizards lived there openly. Magical businesses flourished there. Travelers passed through regularly. Yet in 1612, during one of the best-known Goblin rebellions, Goblin forces established their headquarters inside the Three Broomsticks. The decision was so memorable that centuries later, a plaque remained mounted on the inn's wall, quietly recording the role the building had played in the conflict. When Harry Potter first visited the Three Broomsticks in his third year at Hogwarts, he saw a bustling inn filled with butterbeer, laughter, and conversation. Madame Rosmerta moved between tables serving customers. Students crowded around the fire during winter visits. It felt warm and welcoming. Yet the building carried a much older memory hidden beneath its comfortable atmosphere. Long before Rosmerta's era, long before Hogwarts students filled the village on weekends, the inn had stood at the center of a rebellion. The contrast is remarkable. A place associated with comfort and hospitality had once functioned as the operational center of an armed uprising against wizard authority. The Goblin Rebellion of 1612 occupies a unique position in wizarding history because it is one of the few uprisings tied directly to a specific surviving location. Most rebellions are remembered through dates, records, and lectures. The 1612 conflict left behind something more tangible. Visitors can stand inside the same building where rebel leaders once gathered. They can touch the walls that witnessed planning sessions and negotiations. The physical presence of the Three Broomsticks transforms the rebellion from an abstract historical event into something startlingly real. History feels different when the place itself still exists. Why Hogsmeade, though? Why not a remote fortress? An underground stronghold? Or a hidden valley? One possibility is strategic visibility. By choosing the most famous wizarding village in Britain, the rebels ensured they could not be ignored. Their presence carried symbolic weight. It communicated confidence. It announced that the conflict had moved beyond local disputes and entered the center of wizarding society. Another possibility involves practical considerations. Hogsmeade occupied an important position near Hogwarts, one of the most influential magical institutions in Britain. Trade routes and travel networks connected the village to the wider magical world. A headquarters there offered visibility, access, and influence all at once. Canon provides only fragments about the actual military details of the rebellion, and those gaps create fascinating mysteries. We know the uprising occurred. We know the Three Broomsticks served as headquarters. We know wizard historians continued discussing it for centuries afterward. Yet many details remain undocumented. How large were the rebel forces? How long did they maintain control of the area? Which specific goblin leaders directed operations? The historical silence surrounding these questions is striking. For a conflict important enough to leave a permanent marker in one of Britain's most famous magical villages, surprisingly little survives about the people who fought it. Professor Binns occasionally referenced the rebellion in his lectures, though his habit of reciting facts without dramatic emphasis often obscured their significance. To Hogwarts students, the year 1612 became another date to memorize for examinations. Yet imagine standing in Hogsmeade during those days. The village streets would not have been filled with students carrying sweets from honeydukes. There was no Zonko's joke shop entertaining visitors. Instead, tension hung over the settlement. Messengers moved through the village. Rumors spread between households. Every conversation carried the possibility of political consequence. The peaceful village known to Harry Potter briefly became a center of unrest. Why does the rebellion of 1612 continue to matter when later uprisings also occurred? The answer lies partly in memory. Certain events become symbols, larger than themselves. The rebellion transformed from a single conflict into a representation of the broader Goblin struggle. Historians could point to it as evidence of how serious tensions had become. Teachers could use it to explain the dangers of unresolved disputes. Even ordinary witches and wizards encountered reminders of it whenever they visited the Three Broomsticks. Physical reminders often preserve history more effectively than books. A plaque on a wall can survive generations of forgotten lectures. The conflict also highlights an uncomfortable truth about wizarding society. By 1612, tensions between goblins and wizards had already endured for centuries. This was not a new disagreement. It was the continuation of an argument inherited from earlier generations. The issues remained familiar: political exclusion, legal inequality, ownership disputes, and wand rights. Different leaders came and went. Different regions experienced unrest. Yet the fundamental questions barely changed. That persistence suggests neither side believed the existing arrangements were sustainable. Temporary peace occurred. Permanent resolution did not. Another intriguing detail emerges when considering Hogwarts itself. The castle stood only a short distance away from the rebellion's headquarters. Students attended classes nearby while one of the most significant goblin uprisings in history unfolded within the surrounding region. The exact impact on Hogwarts is not extensively documented, but it is difficult to imagine the school remaining entirely untouched. Professors would have discussed developments, families would have worried about safety, older students likely followed events with intense curiosity. The proximity of Hogwarts reminds us that political conflicts rarely remain confined to governments and soldiers. Their effects ripple outward into ordinary lives. Why didn't the rebellion permanently change the relationship between goblins and wizards? The simple answer is that neither side achieved a lasting solution to the underlying problems. Conflicts can end without being resolved. A battle concludes. Negotiations occur. Daily life resumes. Yet if the original grievances remain, future unrest becomes likely. The history of the Goblin rebellions demonstrates this pattern repeatedly. One uprising fades. Another emerges decades later. The cycle continues because the causes survive. In many ways, the story of Goblin resistance is less a sequence of separate rebellions than a single argument unfolding across centuries. As the 17th century progressed, wizarding leaders increasingly recognized that old approaches were failing. Britain needed stronger institutions. It needed centralized authority. It needed a government capable of managing relations between witches, wizards, goblins, centaurs, house elves, and countless other magical beings. The solution eventually arrived in 1707 with the formal establishment of the Ministry of Magic. Its founders hoped organization would bring stability. They hoped laws could prevent future crises. They hoped structure could accomplish what centuries of scattered governance had failed to achieve. Yet history often contains a quiet irony. The creation of the ministry solved some problems immediately. it also planted the seeds of new conflicts that would shape the next era of Goblin rebellions. Did the creation of the Ministry of Magic solve the Goblin problem, or did it make future rebellions unavoidable? In 1707, the Ministry of Magic officially became the central governing authority of magical Britain. The decision marked one of the most important political changes in wizarding history. For the first time, a single institution claimed responsibility for overseeing magical law, regulating magical creatures and beings, maintaining secrecy for muggles, and managing relations across wizarding society. To many witches and wizards, this looked like progress. Order would replace fragmentation, consistent laws would replace regional disputes. Yet from the perspective of many non-human magical communities, including goblins, centralized authority also meant centralized control. The ministry structure reflected wizard priorities from the very beginning. Departments were created, regulations expanded, bureaucracy grew steadily more sophisticated. Among the most significant developments was the ongoing effort to classify magical creatures and beings. This process eventually led to the establishment of divisions responsible for creatures, beings, and spirits. The intention was administrative clarity. The consequences were far more complicated. Classification determined who possessed rights, who could participate in negotiations, and whose interests received official attention. For goblins, these questions were not abstract matters of paperwork. They directly affected daily life and political influence. One of the most revealing moments in ministry history occurred in 1811, when the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures was formally established. Although this event lay more than a century in the future, its roots stretch back into the early ministry era. The government spent decades attempting to define relationships with magical beings. Centaurs, merpeople, werewolves, house elves, and goblins all occupied different positions within the wizarding world. Each presented unique challenges. Goblins, however, stood apart because of their economic importance. They were neither isolated nor dependent. Through banking, craftsmanship, and commerce, they remained deeply integrated into magical society, while simultaneously resisting full wizard control. Why did classification become such a sensitive issue for goblins? The answer lies in dignity. The distinction between a being and a creature sounds technical until you understand what it represented. According to wizarding definitions, a being was generally capable of understanding magical law and participating in the shaping of that law. A creature occupied a lower category. These classifications evolved over time and often changed as different officials revised policies. Goblins consistently pushed for recognition that reflected their intelligence and capabilities. They saw themselves as a people with their own traditions, laws, and culture. Any classification suggesting otherwise felt deeply insulting. Political disagreements often begin with resources. They become much harder to solve when identity enters the equation. The early ministry also inherited all the unresolved disputes that had fueled previous rebellions. Wand rights remained controversial. Ownership of goblin-made artifacts remained controversial. Representation remained controversial. Creating a government did not erase these issues. It simply provided a larger stage upon which they could continue. Ministry officials frequently approached goblin concerns through regulation. Goblins frequently approached them through resistance. Both sides believed they were protecting legitimate interests. Both sides increasingly viewed the other as unreasonable. The pattern would become familiar across the next 2 centuries. Why did wizards continue refusing to extend wand rights despite repeated unrest? Official explanations emphasized safety and stability. Wands amplified magical capability. Ministry leaders worried about the consequences of expanding access. Yet goblins could point to an obvious inconsistency. Wizards regularly trusted goblins with vast quantities of wealth. Gringotts stored fortunes belonging to some of the most influential families in Britain. Powerful magical artifacts passed through goblin hands. Goblin-made enchantments protected valuable treasures. If goblins were trusted with these responsibilities, why were they considered too dangerous to possess wands? Questions like this became increasingly difficult to dismiss. During the 18th century, Gringotts itself grew into an institution of extraordinary importance. Founded in 1474 by the Goblin Gringot, the bank had already existed for centuries by the time the ministry emerged. Its influence continued expanding throughout the 18th century. Wealthy wizarding families deposited fortunes within its vaults. International transactions passed through its systems. Security measures became legendary. Dragons eventually guarded the deepest vaults. Enchantments such as Thief's Downfall protected against deception and concealment. Every expansion of Gringotts increased goblin influence. Every increase in goblin influence made political tensions more significant. Economic power and political exclusion rarely coexist peacefully forever. A curious contradiction began defining wizard-goblin relations during this period. Wizards depended heavily upon goblin expertise. They trusted goblins to safeguard family fortunes accumulated across generations. They commissioned goblin-made treasures. They respected goblin craftsmanship. Yet many wizard officials remained reluctant to treat goblins as political equals. The contradiction appears repeatedly throughout magical history. It is visible in laws, institutions, and attitudes. It survives all the way into Harry Potter's era. Griphook's suspicion of wizards did not emerge from nowhere. It reflected centuries of accumulated experience. Why didn't increased cooperation through Gringotts reduce hostility? Economic partnerships can create stability, but they can also magnify grievances. The closer two groups become, the more opportunities arise for conflict. Every disputed inheritance involving a goblin-made artifact reinforced old arguments about ownership. Every regulation concerning banking, trade, or magical law became another point of negotiation. Frequent interaction did not eliminate disagreements. It ensured those disagreements remained constantly visible. Neither side could simply withdraw from the relationship. Their futures had become too interconnected. As the 18th century advanced, goblin rebellions continued erupting across Britain. Historical records reference multiple uprisings during this era, though many details remain sparse. What is clear is that the ministry's existence did not bring lasting peace. Instead, the government found itself repeatedly confronting the same underlying tensions that had troubled earlier generations. Officials changed. Policies evolved. Yet the central disputes remained remarkably consistent. It became increasingly apparent that these conflicts were not temporary disturbances, but structural features of wizard-goblin relations. Some modern readers notice a striking parallel between these events and later moments in the Harry Potter series. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione negotiate with Griphook over the Sword of Gryffindor in Deathly Hallows, they encounter many of the same disagreements that fueled centuries of unrest. Ownership, trust, promises, and differing cultural assumptions all collide within a single conversation. Neither side views the situation the same way. Neither side feels fully understood. The exchange serves as a reminder that history often survives not only in books, but in attitudes passed from one generation to the next. By the middle of the 18th century, tensions had reached another breaking point. The ministry possessed greater authority than any previous wizard government. Goblins possessed greater economic influence than ever before. Both sides had become stronger. Neither side had become more willing to surrender its principles. Then came one of the most significant confrontations of the century, a rebellion associated closely with the year 1752. Once again, wand rights stood near the center of the dispute. Once again, questions of equality and power rose to the surface, and once again, magical Britain found itself facing a conflict that exposed just how fragile the peace had always been. Were wizards truly afraid of goblin magic, or were they afraid of what goblins might become if given the same tools as witches and wizards? Few questions sit closer to the heart of the 18th century goblin rebellions. By the year 1752, the Ministry of Magic had governed Britain for 45 years. It possessed departments, regulations, enforcement mechanisms, and growing confidence in its authority. Yet despite this expanding bureaucracy, tensions with goblin communities remained unresolved. Historical references identify 1752 as the year of a significant goblin rebellion, one closely associated with continuing disputes over wand rights. The conflict did not emerge suddenly. It represented the latest chapter in a disagreement that had already endured for centuries. To understand the emotional force behind the wand debate, it is important to remember how central wands were to wizard identity. Nearly every aspect of British magical life revolved around wand use. Hogwarts education was built around wand-based spellcasting. Ministry employment assumed wand proficiency. Duels, transportation, defense, healing, and countless daily activities relied upon wand magic. A witch or wizard carried a wand not merely as a tool, but as an extension of self. When goblins demanded access to wands, many wizards interpreted the request as a challenge to the foundations of their society. What goblins saw as a matter of rights, many wizards perceived as a threat to stability. The irony, of course, was that goblins already demonstrated remarkable magical capability. Without wands, their enchantments often achieved results unfamiliar to wizard craftsmen. Goblin-made metal retained magical properties across centuries. Goblin security systems protected treasures against theft and deception. The defenses later seen within Gringotts illustrate just how sophisticated goblin magic could become. Long before Harry, Ron, and Hermione infiltrated Bellatrix Lestrange's vault, goblin enchantments had earned a reputation for effectiveness throughout the wizarding world. The argument, therefore, was never about whether goblins could perform magic. It was about whether they should gain access to the particular form of power embodied by wands. Why did neither side manage to compromise? One reason lies in how differently they understood the issue. Ministry officials often approached wand ownership as a regulatory matter. Goblins viewed it as a question of status. A regulation can be adjusted. A statement about social position cuts much deeper. If a government repeatedly tells a community that it cannot be trusted with the same tools available to everyone else, that message inevitably accumulates emotional weight. Over generations, practical disagreements become symbols. Symbols are harder to negotiate because they carry meaning beyond their immediate function. The rebellion of 1752 unfolded within this atmosphere of accumulated frustration. Canon provides fewer battlefield details than many modern historians would prefer, but the event's importance is unmistakable. The uprising became one of the notable Goblin rebellions remembered in wizarding history. Ministry authorities responded with efforts to restore order and reinforce existing regulations. Goblin resistance demonstrated that the underlying grievances remained powerful enough to inspire collective action. Neither outcome fundamentally resolved the dispute. The rebellion ended. The argument continued. By this period, Gringotts had become almost impossible to separate from discussions of Goblin influence. Founded nearly 3 centuries earlier by the Goblin Gringot, the bank stood as a visible reminder of Goblin competence and independence. Wealthy families entrusted their fortunes to Goblin security rather than ministry vaults. Ancient heirlooms rested behind Goblin protections. International reputation enhanced the institution's prestige. The more successful Gringotts became, the more difficult it was for some goblins to accept political limitations imposed by wizard governments. Economic success often increases expectations. A community that knows its own value rarely remains content with restricted influence indefinitely. Why did the ministry continue relying so heavily upon a group it frequently viewed with suspicion? The answer is simple and uncomfortable. Goblins were extraordinarily good at what they did. Wizard society benefited enormously from Goblin craftsmanship, banking expertise, and magical knowledge. Replacing those contributions would have been nearly impossible. The relationship resembled a partnership in which neither side fully trusted the other, yet neither side could walk away. Such arrangements often endure for long periods. They can also become surprisingly volatile. Every disagreement carries the weight of mutual dependence. The 18th century witnessed several Goblin rebellions beyond the uprising of 1752. Historical references speak of recurring unrest, demonstrating that the conflict was not confined to a single event. Different regions experienced different tensions. Different leaders emerged. Yet familiar themes appeared again and again. Wand rights remained controversial. Representation remained controversial. Ownership disputes remained controversial. It is striking how little the central issues changed despite the passage of generations. Entire lifetimes passed, while the same arguments resurfaced in slightly different forms. A popular theory among readers of wizarding history suggests that goblins and wizards often misunderstood one another because each side assumed its own worldview was self-evidently correct. The theory cannot be proven, but examples appear throughout canon. Consider the Sword of Gryffindor. Wizards generally regard it as a treasured heirloom belonging to Hogwarts and the legacy of Godric Gryffindor. Many goblins regard it as a goblin-made artifact, wrongfully retained by wizard owners. Both interpretations emerge from internally consistent systems of belief. Neither side begins from the same assumptions. Conversations become difficult when participants disagree about the meaning of ownership itself. As the decades passed, the ministry attempted various approaches to maintaining stability. Regulations expanded. Negotiations occurred. Administrative structures grew more complex. Yet complexity does not guarantee harmony. Governments can become highly organized while remaining unable to solve foundational disagreements. In fact, larger bureaucracies sometimes struggle because every solution creates new layers of procedure. Goblins often interpreted additional regulations as evidence that wizard authorities preferred control to cooperation. Ministry officials often interpreted goblin resistance as proof that stricter oversight remained necessary. Each side's actions reinforced the fears of the other. Why do the Goblin rebellions occupy such a prominent place in Hogwarts education when many other conflicts receive less attention? The answer may lie in what they reveal about magical society itself. These rebellions were never simply military confrontations. They exposed questions about power, law, identity, and coexistence. Students learning about them were also learning about the limits of wizard authority and the consequences of political exclusion. Professor Binns rarely presented the subject in such dramatic terms, but the implications remain visible beneath the dates and names. The Goblin rebellions forced magical Britain to confront issues it could not easily ignore. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the conflict entered a new phase. The ministry remained firmly established. Gringotts continued growing in influence. Hogwarts educated generation after generation of young witches and wizards who memorized rebellion dates for examinations. Yet beneath the apparent stability, tensions endured. New goblin leaders emerged. New uprisings appeared. The 19th century would produce some of the most determined resistance yet. And with it came another mystery. Wizard history books carefully recorded the rebellions themselves. Far less attention was given to the goblins who led them. Their names faded, their stories fragmented. Yet their impact on magical Britain remained impossible to erase. Why do wizarding history books remember the dates of goblin rebellions so clearly, while revealing so little about the goblins who actually led them? It is one of the most curious patterns in magical scholarship. Students at Hogwarts learn that goblin rebellions occurred throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. They memorize years. They study ministry responses. They review examination questions built around causes and consequences. Yet the individual goblins who organized, negotiated, fought, and shaped these events often remain frustratingly obscure. The imbalance says something important about the way history is preserved. Governments tend to record challenges to their authority. They are often less interested in preserving the stories of those who created those challenges. By the 19th century, magical Britain appeared outwardly stable. The Ministry of Magic functioned as the central government. Hogwarts continued educating young witches and wizards in the Highlands of Scotland. Gringotts remained the dominant financial institution of the wizarding world. Diagon Alley flourished as a commercial center. To many observers, society seemed secure. Yet beneath this stability, the familiar tensions between goblins and wizard authorities persisted. The fact that additional goblin rebellions continued erupting during this period demonstrates how little the underlying issues had changed. Stability on the surface did not necessarily indicate satisfaction underneath. One reason the 19th century matters so much is that it transformed the way magical Britain remembered the earlier conflicts. Historical scholarship expanded. Records became more organized. Educational institutions incorporated rebellion history into formal curricula. Professor Cuthbert Binns, who would eventually become Hogwarts' only ghost professor, devoted enormous portions of his history of magic lessons to goblin rebellions. By Harry Potter's era, these lectures had become infamous. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, students quickly discover that Binns's classroom is one of the easiest places in Hogwarts to fall asleep. Ironically, the subject matter itself is anything but dull. The history contains wars, political struggles, betrayals, negotiations, and centuries of unresolved grievances. Why were goblins still willing to rebel after generations of setbacks? The answer may lie in the persistence of the issues they considered most important. Wand restrictions remained in place. Questions of representation remained unresolved. Ownership disputes involving goblin-made artifacts continued appearing across magical society. Every new generation inherited the same arguments from the previous one. Imagine growing up hearing stories about rights denied to your grandparents and great-grandparents. Imagine watching those disputes remain unresolved, despite decades of promises and negotiations. Under such circumstances, frustration can become part of cultural memory. The ministry, meanwhile, faced its own dilemma. Officials genuinely feared instability. Every rebellion threatened public safety, disrupted commerce, and challenged governmental authority. Many ministry leaders believed they were protecting magical Britain by maintaining strict controls. Some undoubtedly viewed goblin demands as unreasonable or dangerous. Others likely recognized legitimate grievances, but worried about the consequences of major concessions. Governance often involves choosing between competing risks. The problem was that each attempt to preserve order frequently reinforced goblin perceptions of inequality. Measures intended to prevent unrest sometimes fueled future unrest instead. Gringotts continued standing at the center of this complicated relationship. The bank's influence expanded throughout the 19th century as magical commerce grew more sophisticated. Families stored heirlooms within its vaults. Businesses relied upon its services. International reputation enhanced its authority even further, yet every witch or wizard entering Gringotts encountered a subtle reminder of goblin independence. The institution was not merely staffed by goblins, it belonged to them. Within the heart of Britain's financial system existed a powerful organization operating according to goblin traditions and priorities. That reality carried symbolic significance far beyond banking. Why did wizarding society trust goblins with treasure, but hesitate to trust them with political power? The contradiction becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. During this period, wealth and influence flowed through goblin hands every day. Some of the oldest and most respected wizarding families depended upon Gringotts to safeguard fortunes accumulated across centuries. Goblin-made security systems protected assets that governments themselves might struggle to defend. Yet many of the same voices praising goblin reliability and finance remained cautious about goblin participation in broader political affairs. The distinction reveals a deep tension within wizarding attitudes. Respect and equality are not always granted together. As the century progressed, another important development quietly shaped future events. Interest in magical history grew stronger among scholars and institutions. Historians began organizing records more systematically. Archives expanded, educational standards evolved, yet even with improved documentation, many Goblin perspectives remained absent from mainstream accounts. This absence continues influencing how later generations understand the rebellions. Readers often encounter detailed descriptions of wizard responses while learning relatively little about Goblin motivations beyond broad summaries. The imbalance does not necessarily indicate deliberate deception. Sometimes it reflects which records survived and which did not. Nevertheless, the result is the same. Parts of the story remain hidden. A fascinating example of this problem emerges when comparing wizard and goblin attitudes toward artifacts. Throughout the 19th century, disputes involving goblin-made treasures continued surfacing in historical discussions. The Sword of Gryffindor remained the most famous case, but it was hardly unique. Goblin craftsmen viewed their creations through the lens of makers' rights. Wizards viewed those same objects through the lens of ownership and inheritance. Neither side considered its position strange. Each regarded the other's interpretation as fundamentally flawed. Conflicts rooted in differing assumptions are often the hardest to resolve because both parties believe common sense supports their position. Why does this matter for understanding later events involving Harry Potter? Because many attitudes visible during Harry's adventures were shaped by these centuries of history. When Griphook speaks about the Sword of Gryffindor in Deathly Hallows, he is not expressing a personal eccentricity. He is articulating a cultural belief with deep historical roots. When wizard characters react with confusion or disagreement, they are responding from a tradition equally old. The conversation between Harry and Griphook becomes more meaningful once you recognize that it echoes arguments stretching back hundreds of years. A single sword carries the weight of generations. As the 19th century neared its end, tensions once again approached a critical point. New personalities emerged within Goblin society. Frustrations remained unresolved. The ministry continued balancing authority and negotiation. Then, in the 1890s, another rebellion would become famous for a different reason. Unlike most earlier uprisings, this one would later be explored through a detailed narrative centered around Hogwarts itself. At the center of that story stood a goblin named Ranrock, a figure whose actions would reignite many of the oldest questions in wizard-goblin history and force magical Britain to confront them once again. If Ranrock truly sought domination over wizardkind, why do some people view him less as a villain and more as the product of centuries of failure between goblins and wizards? To answer that question, we must step into the final years of the 19th century, a period explored in the events surrounding Hogwarts' legacy. Before going further, it is important to separate established historical canon from the specific narrative presented in that story. The broader reality of Goblin rebellions is firmly rooted in wizarding history. Ranrock himself belongs to a later narrative set during the 1890s, one that builds upon those historical tensions. Even so, the themes surrounding him feel strikingly familiar. The same disputes over power, respect, and exclusion that shaped earlier rebellions continue echoing through his story. Ranrock emerges as a goblin leader deeply hostile toward wizard authority. Unlike earlier rebellion figures, who survive only as names and historical references, Ranrock is presented with goals, ambitions, and grievances that the audience can directly observe. He forms an alliance with dark wizards, including Victor Rookwood and his followers. This partnership immediately creates a dangerous escalation. Historically, tensions between goblins and wizards often centered on rights and representation. Ranrock's campaign moves beyond political resistance and toward open confrontation. The alliance allows him access to resources and opportunities that would otherwise remain beyond his reach. Yet even while pursuing increasingly destructive objectives, he repeatedly frames his actions as a response to long-standing injustice. Why does Hogwarts itself become so important during this conflict? The answer lies in a form of magic older than most wizarding institutions. Hidden beneath Hogwarts and scattered across the surrounding region are repositories connected to ancient magic, a mysterious force studied by a group known as the Keepers. These Keepers included Professor Percival Rackham, Charles Rookwood, Nia Fitzgerald, and San Bakar. Long before the events of the 1890s, they concealed powerful magical secrets in an effort to prevent misuse. Ranrock becomes obsessed with gaining access to this power. To him, ancient magic represents something far greater than a weapon. It offers the possibility of overturning the balance of power that had favored wizards for centuries. The conflict surrounding ancient magic introduces a fascinating contrast with earlier goblin rebellions. Traditionally, disputes focused on access to rights already possessed by wizards, particularly wand ownership and political influence. Ranrock's pursuit goes further. He seeks access to a force hidden even from most witches and wizards. This distinction matters. The rebellion ceases to be solely about equality. It becomes entangled with questions of control over extraordinary magical power. As the search for ancient magic intensifies, the stakes rise dramatically. The old grievances remain present, but they become intertwined with dangers capable of affecting the entire wizarding world. Professor Eleazar Fig occupies a central role in opposing Ranrock's plans. A respected Hogwarts professor, Fig investigates the growing threat while uncovering connections between the rebellion and ancient magic. His efforts eventually bring him into contact with a fifth-year Hogwarts student possessing the rare ability to perceive and manipulate this ancient force. Together they explore hidden chambers, long-forgotten repositories, and secrets buried beneath the Highlands. Throughout their journey, the shadow of the Goblin rebellions remains ever present. What initially appears to be a struggle over magical power gradually reveals itself as part of a much older story. The past refuses to remain buried. Why are some viewers sympathetic to Ranrock, despite the destruction he causes? The answer lies not in his methods, but in the context surrounding them. Canonically, his actions become increasingly dangerous and cannot be justified. Innocent people are threatened. Ancient magic is pursued recklessly. Alliances with dark wizards deepen the crisis. Yet many observers notice that his anger emerges from genuine historical tensions. Goblins had experienced centuries of exclusion, restrictions, and mistrust. Recognizing the background does not excuse Ranrock's choices. It does, however, explain why some audiences view him as a tragic figure shaped by forces larger than himself. One of the most interesting aspects of the story involves the keepers themselves. Rackham, Fitzgerald, Rookwood, and Bakar are presented as guardians acting to protect the wizarding world from dangerous magic. Their intentions are largely noble, yet the narrative occasionally raises uncomfortable questions about secrecy and authority. The keepers decide who can access ancient magic. They determine what knowledge should remain hidden. They place enormous trust in their own judgment. These decisions mirror broader themes that appear throughout Goblin Rebellion history. Again and again, power is concentrated in the hands of those who believe they know best. Again and again, excluded groups challenge that arrangement. The Highlands themselves become a landscape marked by conflict. Villages suffer attacks. Loyalists aligned with Ranrock operate throughout the region. Ancient ruins reveal traces of forgotten magic. Beneath all of this lies Hogwarts, watching over events much as it had watched previous centuries of unrest. The castle has survived Goblin rebellions before. It stood during the uprising of 1612. It witnessed political changes, ministry reforms, and countless disputes between magical communities. In the 1890s, it once again finds itself near the center of a conflict shaped by tensions older than any living participant. Why does the story resonate so strongly with themes found throughout wizarding history? Because beneath the dragons, ancient repositories, and magical battles lies a familiar pattern. A group feels excluded. Authorities insist restrictions are necessary. Distrust grows on both sides. Eventually, the situation reaches a breaking point. The specific details change across centuries, but the structure remains recognizable. Ranrock's rebellion feels connected to earlier Goblin rebellions because it emerges from many of the same unresolved questions. Different era, different leader, similar wounds. The climax of the conflict ultimately revolves around ancient magic rather than traditional political demands. Ranrock transforms himself through the power he has pursued, becoming something far more dangerous than a rebel leader. The threat he poses extends beyond wizard-goblin relations. It becomes a threat to the wider magical world. His defeat brings the immediate crisis to an end. Yet the deeper issues remain unresolved. Defeating a leader is easier than resolving centuries of mistrust. The story closes one chapter while leaving the larger historical argument intact. And perhaps that is what makes Ranrock's tale so interesting when viewed alongside the broader history of Goblin rebellions. It demonstrates how old conflicts adapt to new circumstances. The names change, the methods change, the magical forces involved become more powerful, yet beneath everything lies the same enduring question. How can two societies share a world when each believes the other fundamentally misunderstands it? By the time the 20th century arrives and the events leading toward Harry Potter's era begin to unfold, that question remains unanswered, waiting quietly beneath the marble floors of Gringotts and within the pages of every history of magic textbook. What crucial truths about Goblin history might generations of Hogwarts students have missed simply because nobody was truly listening? The question becomes almost impossible to avoid when you think about Professor Cuthbert Binns. By the time Harry Potter arrived at Hogwarts in 1991, Binns had already spent decades teaching history of magic. In fact, he had been teaching for so long that he eventually died and continued giving lessons as a ghost. One morning, according to Hogwarts legend, he simply rose from his chair, left his body behind, and carried on teaching exactly as before. The story is amusing. Yet there is something strangely fitting about the ghost, responsible for preserving the memory of centuries-old conflicts. While generations of students drifted into daydreams during his lectures, some of the most important stories in wizarding history continued passing quietly from year to year. Goblin rebellions formed a major part of Binns's curriculum. Harry, Ron, and Hermione repeatedly encountered the subject throughout their education. The rebellions appeared in lectures, examinations, and assigned reading. Names, dates, causes, and consequences filled classroom hours. Yet the students often struggled to stay engaged. Harry frequently found his thoughts wandering. Ron fought sleep. Even Hermione, usually attentive, occasionally showed signs of frustration with Binns's delivery. The irony is difficult to ignore. The very conflicts that shaped relations between goblins and wizards for centuries became background noise to many young witches and wizards. Knowledge was available, attention was not. Why does this matter? Because history influences the present, whether people remember it or not. By Harry's era, the major goblin rebellions belonged to the past. There were no active uprisings threatening magical Britain. Gringotts operated normally. Goblins and wizards interacted every day. Most people treated the old conflicts as distant historical events. Yet beneath the surface, the attitudes shaped by those centuries still remained. Grievances survived. Assumptions survived. Distrust survived. History rarely disappears simply because it is no longer being discussed. A perfect example appears in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows through the character of Griphook. Harry first encounters Griphook in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone when Hagrid escorts him to Gringotts. The goblin helps guide them through the bank's underground passages. At the time, the interaction seems routine. Harry is an 11-year-old boy discovering the wizarding world for the first time. Griphook is merely one of many strange new faces. Yet years later, after Voldemort seizes control of the Ministry and the hunt for Horcruxes reaches its final stages, Griphook returns to the story in a far more significant role. And when he does, centuries of goblin history suddenly become very relevant. Why does Griphook place such importance on the sword of Gryffindor? From Harry's perspective, the answer seems obvious. The sword belonged to Godric Gryffindor. It had appeared to Harry in the Chamber of Secrets. It had helped destroy Horcruxes. It was a treasured artifact of Hogwarts. Yet Griphook sees the matter differently. To him, the sword is a goblin-made object created by Ragnuk I. According to goblin tradition, the sword should never have remained permanently in wizard possession. The disagreement immediately echoes arguments stretching back hundreds of years. What appears to Harry as ownership appears to Griphook as theft. Neither side is inventing its position on the spot. Both are drawing upon ancient traditions. The conversations between Harry and Griphook during Deathly Hallows reveal something remarkable. Neither character is entirely wrong. Harry genuinely needs the sword to help defeat Voldemort. Griphook genuinely believes goblin rights have been ignored for generations. Their conflict does not arise because one side is evil and the other good. It emerges because they interpret the world through different historical experiences. Harry inherits wizard assumptions almost without realizing it. Griphook inherits goblin assumptions in exactly the same way. The disagreement becomes a miniature version of the broader conflict that fueled centuries of goblin rebellions. Why does Griphook ultimately betray Harry, Ron, and Hermione during the Gringotts break-in? The answer depends largely on perspective. From Harry's viewpoint, Griphook breaks an agreement and abandons them at a critical moment. From Griphook's viewpoint, he finally recovers an artifact that should never have remained in wizard hands. The scene becomes much more complex once the history behind it is understood. Griphook is not acting randomly. He is acting according to principles deeply rooted within goblin culture. His actions create enormous problems for Harry and his friends, but they also reveal how powerful historical memory remains, even in the midst of a war against Voldemort. The Gringotts break-in itself serves as one of the most fascinating moments in wizard-goblin relations. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Griphook work together despite profound mistrust on both sides. They pass through Thief's Downfall, ride the underground carts, and eventually reach the Lestrange Vault, guarded by a dragon. Cooperation becomes possible because circumstances demand it. Yet tension never disappears completely. Every conversation carries hidden uncertainty. Every promise is shadowed by differing expectations. The alliance succeeds only temporarily. Old disagreements eventually resurface. Why did centuries of conflict survive into an era facing far greater threats? After all, Voldemort represented a danger to both goblins and wizards. One might expect old disputes to fade in the face of such a crisis. Yet history does not work that way. Communities do not simply forget long-standing grievances because a new threat appears. People continue carrying memories, traditions, and frustrations even during moments of collective danger. The events of Deathly Hallows demonstrate this reality vividly. The fight against Voldemort dominates the narrative, yet the older tensions remain present beneath the surface. The past continues influencing the present. There is something almost tragic about this persistence. Harry spends much of the series building friendships across traditional boundaries. He befriends house elves, such as Dobby. He earns the respect of centaurs. He forms alliances with individuals from many backgrounds. Yet even Harry struggles to fully understand the goblin perspective. His intentions are good, his goals are noble. Nevertheless, centuries of cultural disagreement cannot be erased through goodwill alone. Understanding requires effort. It requires listening. And throughout wizarding history, genuine listening often proved surprisingly rare. By the time Voldemort falls during the Battle of Hogwarts in 1998, the Goblin rebellions belong firmly to the past. No armies march, no rebel headquarters occupy Hogsmeade, no uprisings threaten the Ministry. Yet the deeper questions remain unresolved. Who has the right to define ownership? How should power be shared? What happens when two cultures interpret justice differently? The old rebellions may have ended, but the arguments that produce them continue echoing quietly through Gringotts, through wizard law, and through the memories of those who still remember. In the final part of our journey, we will step back from the battles themselves and examine the larger pattern connecting every goblin rebellion across the centuries, searching for the single thread running through them all. What if every goblin rebellion, from the earliest medieval uprisings to Griphook's dispute with Harry Potter, was really part of the same unfinished argument? When viewed separately, the rebellions can appear disconnected. One occurs in the centuries before the Ministry of Magic. Another erupts in 1612 at the Three Broomsticks. Others spread across the 18th century. Ranrock's conflict unfolds in the 1890s. Griphook's confrontation with Harry takes place during the Second Wizarding War. Yet when you place them side by side, a remarkable pattern emerges. The names change. The dates change. The circumstances change. The central questions remain almost exactly the same. The first of those questions concerns ownership. Few objects illustrate the issue better than the Sword of Gryffindor. Forged by Ragnuk I for Godric Gryffindor, the sword survives as one of the most famous magical artifacts in wizarding history. It appears in Harry Potter in the Chamber of Secrets, when Harry pulls it from the sorting hat to fight the basilisk. It later becomes one of the few objects capable of destroying Horcruxes because it has absorbed basilisk venom. To most witches and wizards, the sword is unquestionably part of Hogwarts' legacy. To many goblins, the sword represents an example of a goblin-made treasure remaining in wizard possession long after its rightful return should have occurred. The disagreement encapsulates centuries of conflicting assumptions in a single object. Why were ownership disputes so difficult to resolve? The answer lies in the fact that neither side believed it was acting unfairly. Wizards inherited traditions based upon permanent transfer of property. Families passed heirlooms from one generation to the next. Wealth moved through inheritance. Ownership survived death. Goblin traditions followed a different path. The creator retained a deeper claim than the purchaser. When a goblin-crafted object remained in wizard possession for centuries, goblins often saw evidence of injustice. Wizards saw evidence of continuity. Both positions felt self-evident to the people holding them. That is what made compromise so elusive. The second recurring issue was power. Wand rights appear throughout the history of goblin rebellions because wands represented more than magical tools. They symbolized participation in wizarding society. Access to wands carried implications about status, trust, and belonging. Ministry officials repeatedly defended restrictions as necessary safeguards. Goblins repeatedly challenged those restrictions. The disagreement survived generations of negotiations, laws, and uprisings. Even when rebellions ended, the underlying debate remained unresolved. It simply waited for the next era to revive it. Why did wizard governments struggle to understand the depth of goblin frustration? One possibility is that power often appears natural to those who already possess it. The Ministry of Magic, Hogwarts, and other major institutions developed primarily under wizard leadership. To many witches and wizards, existing arrangements seemed reasonable because they had always existed. Goblins looked at the same structures and saw exclusion. This difference in perspective shaped nearly every major conflict between the two communities. History repeatedly shows that people can inhabit the same world while experiencing it in profoundly different ways. The Goblin rebellions provide one of the clearest examples within the wizarding universe. A third issue emerges whenever you examine relations between goblins and wizards closely: trust. The absence of trust appears everywhere. Wizards worried that goblins would misuse wands. Goblins worried that wizards would never honor their rights. Ministry regulations reflected suspicion. Rebellions reinforced suspicion. Every conflict made future cooperation more difficult. Even moments of partnership carried hidden tensions. The alliance between Harry and Griphook during the Gringotts break-in demonstrates this perfectly. They needed each other. They respected each other's abilities. Yet neither fully trusted the other, and that lack of trust ultimately shaped the outcome. The strange thing is that both societies depended heavily upon one another despite these tensions. Wizards relied on Gringotts to protect their fortunes. Goblins benefited from trade with wizard communities. Goblin-made treasures circulated throughout magical Britain. Economic connections linked the two groups together across centuries. Neither side could simply walk away. The relationship resembled two neighboring kingdoms sharing the same river. They could argue endlessly about rights and boundaries, but neither could ignore the other's existence. Cooperation remained necessary, even when harmony proved impossible. Why does the story of the Goblin rebellions feel surprisingly modern, despite taking place across centuries of magical history? Perhaps because the conflicts revolve around questions that appear again and again in human societies. Who gets to make the rules? Who decides what is fair? How should different cultures coexist when their values clash? The magical details are unique to the wizarding world, but the underlying tensions feel familiar. Wand rights, ownership traditions, and political representation all become expressions of broader questions about dignity and recognition. That universality helps explain why the subject remains so compelling. Looking back across the timeline, certain images stand out. The headquarters inside the Three Broomsticks during the Rebellion of 1612, ministry officials drafting regulations in the 18th century, goblin craftsmen forging masterpieces beneath the earth, Professor Binns droning through another lecture while exhausted students struggle to stay awake, Ranrock searching desperately for ancient magic beneath Hogwarts, Griphook holding the sword of Gryffindor and seeing something entirely different from what Harry sees. These moments span hundreds of years, yet together they tell a single story. Each scene reflects another chapter in the same long conversation. And now, as our journey reaches its end, we return to where it began. Deep beneath London, the vaults of Gringotts remain silent except for the distant ring of metal against metal. Goblin craftsmen still shape enchanted treasures. Ancient gold still rests behind doors protected by goblin magic. Above ground, witches and wizards move through their daily lives, often unaware of how much history lies beneath their feet. The rebellions themselves have faded into the past. The armies are gone. The battles are over. Yet if you listen closely to the sound of a hammer echoing through the darkness, it becomes easy to imagine that somewhere within those stone corridors, the oldest arguments in wizarding history are still waiting for someone willing to hear them. When you look across the long history of the Goblin rebellions, something surprising begins to emerge. At first glance, the story appears to be about wars, uprisings, political disputes, and ancient grievances. Yet beneath all of those events lies a quieter truth. Again and again, the wizarding world reveals that its greatest conflicts rarely begin with hatred. More often, they begin with misunderstanding. A wizard sees a treasured family heirloom. A goblin sees a stolen creation. A ministry official sees a necessary safeguard. A goblin sees an unjust restriction. Neither side necessarily begins with cruelty in its heart. They begin by looking at the same reality through different lenses, and over time those differences harden into certainty. That pattern appears throughout Rowling's world. The greatest dangers are often born when people stop trying to understand one another. Voldemort's rise is built upon division and dehumanization. Pureblood supremacy depends upon deciding that some lives matter more than others. The mistreatment of house elves survives because many witches and wizards never questioned traditions they inherited. Even the conflict between centaurs and the ministry grows from the same root. The Goblin rebellions belong to this larger picture. They are not isolated chapters tucked away in a history of magic textbook. They are another expression of one of the central themes running through the entire wizarding world. The difficulty of sharing power with those who are different from ourselves. What makes the Goblin story especially compelling is that there are no simple villains within most of it. There are individuals who commit terrible acts, certainly. Ranrock's pursuit of ancient magic becomes destructive. Some ministry policies become unfair. Yet the deeper conflict survives precisely because it is not a battle between good people and evil people. It is a collision between competing ideas of justice. Wizards inherit one understanding of ownership, goblins inherit another. Wizards see wands as tools requiring regulation. Goblins see them as symbols of exclusion. Both sides carry memories stretching back centuries. Both sides believe history supports their position. The tragedy is that each often spends more time defending its own story than listening to the others. You can even see this truth in Harry Potter himself. Throughout the series, Harry succeeds where many others fail because he is willing to cross boundaries. He befriends giants through Hagrid. He earns the trust of centaurs. He treats Dobby with respect when others do not. Yet even Harry struggles when confronted with Griphook's perspective on the sword of Gryffindor. He is not malicious. He is simply a product of the world that raised him. That moment feels important because it reminds you that understanding another culture requires more than kindness. It requires the willingness to question assumptions that have always felt natural. Sometimes that is the hardest kind of courage. Perhaps that is why Professor Binns's lectures matter more than his students ever realized. Beneath the endless dates and names was a warning. History does not disappear when people stop paying attention to it. The Goblin rebellions were never truly about a single law, a single artifact, or a single uprising. They were about memory. Every generation inherited the victories, fears, and disappointments of the one before it. Every generation added something new to the story. The rebellions endured because the underlying questions endured. Who belongs? Who decides? What do we owe one another when we share the same world? And so, as the night grows quiet and the centuries begin to settle back into stillness, you find yourself once more beneath the streets of London. The marble halls of Gringotts stand silent. Rows of vaults disappear into darkness. Ancient gold rests undisturbed behind enchanted doors. Somewhere far below, beyond the reach of lantern light, A goblin hammer strikes metal. The sound rings softly through the stone, lingers for a moment, and fades away. Then there is only silence and the memory of that distant echo carrying through the dark